Sometimes we make mistakes, like shutting down the browser or closing the wrong tab in our application. So what's that going to do to our app? Well, luckily we have some features like local storage where we can actually save off the state of our application and then rehydrate it when we need to. So in this module, we're going to learn how we can take advantage of the local storage features and integrate them with some features available from Breeze in an Angular service. The story for our module really revolves around one big question. What happens when the browser closes? I mean, sometimes we close it by accident, by hitting a tab or just closing the browser itself. And sometimes it's not so much of an accident. What if it crashes? Well, in that case, if we can save state, we can really recover quickly. How do we do that though? Well, we're going to use HTML5 local storage to accomplish this. We'll be saving off the entities from the Breeze cache out to local storage and then importing them back at a later time so we can recover the app. And saving the local storage is going to help us reduce the round trips as well, so we don't have to go back to the server to get data that we may have cached in local storage. So we're going to add some features to our app to handle this scenario of when the browser closes, and we'll also demonstrate how we're going to be able to export the entities out from Breeze off to local storage in a serialized string. And then of course we're going to rehydrate it back from local storage into Breeze. So it's important to start out with what is it that we actually want to accomplish and then how are we going to use these to save the state? Well, we want to use local storage. That's the tool to get there. And because we're using Angular and Breeze, we want to make sure that our solution integrates well with Breeze and how it's managing our entities. And it exposes APIs for importing, exporting, and of course clearing out the storage. And following good separation patterns, we want to wrap this thing up inside of an Angular service. So with those goals in mind, let's go work on the solution. To get us started, there's a NuGet package that'll help us out. So let's go into the Package Manager console. We'll type install package Angular Breeze, and then it's called Storage Whip. And this is a package that I wrote that really helps wrap up the features for handling local storage with Breeze and Angular. Here we can see there's two things we have to do to set up. First, we need to grab this script reference. So we want to make sure the new file that we have is actually included in index.html. Let's do that first. So go into index.html, we'll scroll on down, and here's our third-party vendor scripts. And we'll go into the scripts folder, and we can see right here, Angular Breeze Storage Whip. Let's drag that over. And let's make sure we can find it. And it's right here. Now the next thing we have to do is include this module dependency in with our module. So we want to do what this code says here, and that's inside of our app.js. So right up top, we're going to make sure we add in the dependency here. And this one's called ngz whip. Ng for Angular, Z for Breeze, and then work in progress. This is going to pull in our Angular to Breeze local storage features. And we'll be using this module, ngz whip, here in this module to talk about local storage, and in the next module when we get into work in progress. And that's all we have to do to get the package. Now that we have the storage service set up, we need to configure it. So we'll go into config.js. And there's going to be a configuration provider that we're going to set up, just like we did for the Directus config provider. So let's set up this provider using app-config. The name of this is going to be zStorage config provider. And then we have to define the inline function for the configuration. And you may be wondering, how do you know what the name of the provider is? Well, let's go take a look at that for a moment. If we look inside the scripts folder in the Angular Breeze Storage Whip, first we can see a provider right here on line 30 where it's the zStorage config. And that's going to basically just be that plus the word provider, and that's how Angular will find it. And we're also seeing some of the default settings for the config provider. Let's actually grab this object literal right there so we can use that as a good starting point. Now let's come back to our config, and here we're going to say config.config. And we want to equal the object literal that we just copied, and we don't need the comment. We're going to enable storage to start off. By default, it was false. And the key just represents how we're going to store this in local storage. We'll just give it the name of our app. And then the events, I like to keep them all in one place. So let's take those out for a moment. And let's go up a little bit inside of here, and you can see we've got some events already defined right here. So let's define an event for the storage events. Now we've got all our events defined in one place. We can scroll back down to our config provider, and I just say events.storage. Now we're not going to use the whip key right now, but let's fill that in, and let's just call this the name of our app. app.whip. We'll talk about work in progress, or WIP, in the next module. We already have an app error prefix. That's basically going to be a prefix before any errors that we want to use. If we scroll up a little bit, we can see that right here in config app error prefix. So we'll override the default. We need a way to get a new GUID. Storage is going to use that for the work in progress, again, which we'll take a look at in the next module. For now, we'll just use the feature of Breeze to go get a GUID. And then we need a version for our app. We already have an app version right in config called config version. And that's all we have to do to configure the application. Now let's run it and make sure things are still working. And we'll go to the F12 tools and refresh just to make sure everything's loading. And then we see no errors loading down on the page. So we should be good. And let's click on another page, just make sure we're okay. And as you're developing an application, you may notice things that you weren't focusing on that are going wrong. For example, right up here at the top, we have a problem with our theming. Notice we've got this padding up here. It's actually an extra padding of about 45 pixels that shouldn't be there. Now when I stretch it out, things are actually going to be okay if I get rid of the F12 tools. But once I add them back in, a media query is kicking in and pushing it down. Now how do I know that? Well, let's go ahead and inspect that element. When we do that, we can see that the body here has got a padding of top 45. Well, if I uncheck that, you see it goes right back to the top. The problem is I can't uncheck that because then, when I go back without the tools, notice I lost my search bar and everything's kind of scrunched at the top. So we have an issue there. Fortunately, I know what the problem is. The problem is actually what we did inside of index.html. So if you go inside of index.html, you'll see here that the responsive parts of Bootstrap are happening before our custom theme. Well, our custom theme is actually changing how the padding works in the top. Well, we want the responsive nature of the media queries to happen instead. So we'll move the Bootstrap responsive below the custom theme, so that way the cascading style sheets will happen in the order that we want. Now if we flip back over to the application, now when the app loads up, we can refresh the cache. And now notice we don't have the padding issue anymore under our media query. And if I get rid of the F12 tools, it still works this way as well. We want our repositories to load from storage if available and save at key moments. But first, it only makes sense that if we're going to let them do that, then the repositories and data context are going to have to be aware of our ZStorage service. So let's do that now. First, let's go into the services for data context. And let's start off by injecting in the ZStorage service. Now, there's going to be places that are going to want to call the ZStorage features. So let's go ahead and expose that right from the data context. For example, one of our controllers may want to call into one of the ZStorage's APIs directly. And now we want to make sure that we initialize the ZStorage. And because this is a place where we kick off all of our data services, we'll do it right here. And there's an init function on ZStorage, and it wants the manager because it knows about Breeze and it knows it needs an entity manager. And now let's go make sure our repositories are storage aware. Now, why do they need it? Because they're going to be querying data, and whenever we get the data in, we may want to save it off to storage. So let's go to repository attendee, and we'll put ZStorage right up here. We'll make sure we keep our sequences correct. And then let's put ZStorage right on the constructor. This will allow the abstract repository to have access to the same storage. Now let's do the same thing for our other repositories. We'll do it for lookups. We'll do it for sessions. And we'll do it for speakers. And now, through dependency injection, we've made all of our data access points aware of the storage. Along the way, as we're working with local storage and our ZStorage service, we may have different messages that come out of storage, such as when storage changed or when errors happen to occur. So we want to listen for those. And since a place we kind of kick all the storage off in the data context, after we initialize it, let's put a function in here called listen for storage events. Now let's go add that function. And here we're going to listen for some events that the ZStorage service exposes for us and broadcasts. We'll do that on the root scope. And these are the events that we define in config. We had config.events, and then we had the storage events. And the first one we're going to listen for is storage has changed. And then we're going to have a function which passes in the event and some data about that event. And for now, we'll just log out a message. So now whenever the storage changes, it's going to say update local storage and show us a toast and log to the console. Now there's a couple other events that it exposes too. So we'll just copy and paste quick. And we'll make sure we don't make a mistake on these. The next one's going to be whip changed, if that's a work in progress. And the final one's probably the most important. That's if there was an error when it tried to read or write from storage. And that one's actually going to have some information about what was that error, so we'll put in the data.activity. These are just part of the APIs that are exposed from the zStorage service. Now, I highly recommend that you follow this kind of a pattern whenever you're working with other services to make sure that you're listening to what they're telling you. That way, as you're developing, if you make a mistake or something happens that you didn't set up for or configure properly, then at least you're getting the messages back. One of the nice features when you start pulling in services that kind of encapsulate functionality for you is sometimes you can refactor out code that you don't have to write anymore. In our case, we wrote a function called rItemsLoaded, and that's going to tell us if we already loaded the items in a Breeze's cache or not. Well, the zStorage service actually helps and exposes that for us. So let's take a look quickly inside the zStorage file, and down around line 132, we can see there's got an API of clear, init, load, and save, but it's also got an rItemsLoaded. Well, let's take advantage of that and refactor out the code that we wrote. Now, we used that here in repository attendees on line 36 and a couple other places, but we actually wrote it in the repository abstract. So let's go find that. Right here we expose it. We won't need to expose it anymore, so we'll delete that, and we'll delete this entire function. Deleting code is a lot of fun, isn't it? You can sign me up for that because that's less code to maintain. Now that we took it out of repository abstract, we need to go back into repository attendee, and it has no idea what this thing is now. So instead of self rItemsLoaded, we'll be talking to the zStorage service, and it has a function called rItemsLoaded. We'll have to tell it what kind of thing is that. Well, that's going to be our attendees. And then any other place that we used it, which happens to be down here in the query succeeded, after we get the data back for attendees, we actually set that property. So now we'll call zStorage rItemsLoaded and set it to true. And again, we have to tell it which kind it is. And there's one other place that we have it as well, down here in the get count. And we also use the rItemsLoaded for our repository session. So let's go look there too. We'll find rItemsLoaded right here. So again, we can look at self.zStorage rItemsLoaded. We'll put this one with the key of sessions. We find our next instance right down here. So both those are going to check to see if we have items loaded now. And then the final one is when we're actually getting the data. When it comes back, we're going to set it. So here we're going to set the sessions to true. Now we didn't add any functionality here. All we did is remove some code to basically get the same functionality we already had by taking advantage of what was built into zStorage. And again, the rItemsLoaded function is just a flag that we're setting. So let's take a quick look at the APIs we're going to use to save out to local storage. First, we're going to call the entity manager from Breeze its export entities function. And that's going to serialize all the entities and all the metadata from Breeze, and then save that off to a string. And then we'll take that string and we'll pass it into local storage. Here we're using Angular's Windows service to call off to local storage, and we're going to set the item, pass in a key, and also pass in our data. And when it comes time to get that data back out of local storage, we'll import it in using the Windows local storage get item. Again, we'll pass in that key, we'll get out our data. And once we get our data out, we'll use Breeze's import entities feature, and we'll suck that right into the entity manager. The next chapter of our story is that we need our repositories to be able to save the storage at key moments in time. Now that everything's been configured and set up and all the repositories are aware of storage, let's do that. And we'll start in the data context. There's a couple places that it's really important to do that here. First is in the prime method. So let's go look for that. Remember, the prime method runs as soon as our app starts up. And when we do that, we also get some lookup information for rooms and tracks and time slots and speaker partials. So after we get those, it'd be ideal to save that to local storage. So after we get back our lookups right here in the success, let's save it. And to do that, we'll call zStorage and then save. And that will save off all the lookup information into local storage for us. One other place we want to look for is the save method. And if we scroll down a bit, after we actually make changes and save it, this would be another place where we want to save to storage. So we'll tell it to go ahead and save here too. We only want to do this on a successful save. Next up, let's go to Repository Abstract. And we're going to look for all the places where we make queries for new data. The first place is going to be down here in the Get by ID. So there's the function on line 52. And if it works, and the query succeeded, we'll go ahead and save out to storage. Moving on down the line, let's go to Repository Attendee. And when we go get our information, right here in this function for get all, after we run this query here, and the query has succeeded, we're going to set the ritems loaded flag, and we're also going to go ahead and save out to storage. Now let's flip over to Repository Lookup, and here we have one place we go get data, and that's going to be in get all. And after we get back our data and query succeeded, we're going to call into save the storage again. So anytime we get our lookups, we save off that data to local storage. Now let's go over to Repository Session. And there's a couple of functions up here where it goes and gets data. And that key one is going to be the get partials function. So let's go find him. After we go and call that query that hits remotely and it comes back successfully, we'll set it right here. And finally, one last place is going to be in Repository Speaker. And again, in its get partials function. After it gets that data, calls the query, comes back successfully from being remote, we'll go ahead and set it. Let's do a quick check here. We'll do a Control-Shift-F, and we'll search for cstorage.save, just to find all the places we put it. And recap, we did it in two places in data context, the prime and the save methods. And then in the 5 different repositories, we actually save off to storage whenever we're getting the full set of fresh data. And the cool part about using a service like ZStorage is it's just one line of code we had to add in these places. Now it's time to take a look at our app and make sure that it's actually saving data off to storage. And I'll give you a hint, we actually have an error somewhere in the application. But let's take a look and see what happens when we run first. Bam, right up here we've got root scope is undefined. What's going on? Well, what actually happens, we forgot to put it in the data context as a dependency. But let's go take a look at the error message that we're getting in the console window and see if that helps us. Right here, root scope is not defined. It's not helping because it just says Angular doesn't know what it is. Well, if we scroll up, we're going to see exactly where this happened. Right there in Listen for Storage Events, we're using it on line 77 of the data context. So that has no idea what it is. So let's go over to the data context, and we'll find that method up on line 77. And right there's our root scope. Well, we have to tell it what that is, so let's go ahead and use it. So up here, we'll add in that dependency. And now let's run the application again. We'll open up the developer tools and we'll refresh to make sure we're not caching anything. This time we have no error messages. That's great. And now let's go ahead and look and see what's happening in local storage. If we open up the developer tools pretty wide and click on resources, you'll see a tab here and a section called local storage. And under there, we've got our local host. Now you can see the key that we created. That's the key we set up in the config.js. And then over here in the value, you can see a bunch of information in there. So if we double click it, and let's highlight that. Now let's open up a tool called Sublime Text. And in here, I'm going to create a new document. It's just a nice little text editor. And I'm pasting in everything that was inside of local storage. And I've loaded in a package for Sublime Text called Pretty.json. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do Control-A to highlight everything and then hit Control-Alt-J. And it's going to format all my text for me. So now you can see a quick glimpse over on the right. Here's all the data that gets saved off to local storage. If I scroll to the top, you're going to see some information about Breeze. And there's our isLoaded flags. And then there's some other information about the metadata for this particular set of data. And then as we scroll down, you're going to start seeing all the rooms, the tracks, the time slots, everything. All the way back down to the bottom with some more metadata about the fields in it. Now what's in here is important to Breeze, but you don't actually want to look at it. We're just glad that it got saved to storage. Now that we're saving everything off to storage, let's make sure we can load in from it as well. Now the place to do that is going to be data context. So we don't need to have anything open but the data context now. And we'll go into the prime function. Now prime currently goes off and makes a remote call to get all the lookups and the speaker partials. Well, we want to change that up a little bit. First, let's set a flag for is the storage enabled and does it have data? We'll find that out by asking zStorage, hey, please load up all of your data from local storage into the manager. And if it can do that successfully, it's going to return back true. So first, prime promise still needs to have this code, but we don't want to do that unless we need to. So first we're going to check that flag. If the storage is enabled and it has data, then we're going to do something. What are we going to do? Well, we're all good actually. So we're just going to return back a promise. We'll use qwen to do this, and we'll log a message out just to let everybody know everything's been good. And if there's nothing in local storage, then we're going to call qall, which will call the service lookup getAll and then the getPartials. And right now it's also going to call the extend metadata and success. But let's make sure that's what we want. Really, what's happening here is if we load everything in from local storage, which is what we're doing if the storage is enabled, then we're handling the getAll for lookups and the getPartials for speakers and the extending of the metadata. But there's some things in the success function that's not being handled by local storage. For example, this service lookup set lookups. What this does is it actually sets all the lookups to be a property off the lookup repository. So we want that to happen whether we're getting it out of local storage or if we're going and hitting it remotely. So we don't want the then to be right here. Instead, we actually want it to happen no matter what. So the easiest place to do that's right down there. So now whether we load from local storage or we get it all remotely, either way when we're done, we're going to call the success and that's going to set the lookup properties. So that should do it. Now let's go ahead and run. We'll open the developer tools. Now let's go ahead and refresh to clear out the cache. And now let's go ahead and look inside of local storage for a moment. We can see we've got some data in there. That's good. And now let's take a look inside the network tab. And we'll clear everything out and let's refresh to see do we have any network activity. We'll turn on the filters right there with this button. We'll look at the XHR traffic. Now refresh. And we're seeing a lot of HTML and we saw some initial data come through. And we take a look at this data, the response here. This one's out going get the account of how many attendees that we had. That's not something we cached. And here's another one where we're actually going off and getting an account of how many sessions we had. Again, we didn't cache that. Now let's clear that just a moment. Let's go over to sessions. We got the HTML page, we didn't get any data, but yet the data is over here because we read it in from local storage. So let's back up. Let's go to attendees. Now you might be wondering why we got attendees this time. Well, the reason is because we didn't store that in local storage before. Well, wait a sec. You're saying we do store that in local storage. We wrote the code for that. Yes, we did, but we did not actually go to this page before we saved the local storage, so there was nothing in local storage for it. All right, so that makes sense. Now let's clear this out again. Now let's just back up and let's go over to speakers. Now if we go to the speakers page, we already had the speakers in local storage, so we didn't go get that. Now let's play a little trick. Let's go ahead and copy the URL, and we'll clear out of this browser completely. Let's go ahead and open Chrome directly. And now as it opens up here, we'll open the developer tools, and we'll clear out everything that it's getting from Google. We'll turn on the filters just for XHR. We'll paste into the URL the same URL we had a moment ago. Now we navigate there, we should be able to watch the traffic, and it's just getting HTML pages. Notice we can see speakers though. Let's go back to the dashboard here. And again, just HTML. Let's click on attendees. This time, it didn't go get attendee data because it was in local storage because we had been on that page previously. So now you can see I could really save some network traffic and recover much more quickly just by using local storage. Now there's another chapter to our story. What if we want to clear out the local storage? Well, we have a way we can do that too. And the place I'd like to put that is inside the sidebar as a menu item. Now it's not going to be a route, so we're not going to add it to the routes, which is how the sidebar first gets generated right here. Instead, we'll add another list item. And inside of here, we'll stick an anchor. We'll make the href be nothing. And instead, we'll set up the ng-click directive. When we click on this, let's call a function inside of our controller, and it's going to be called clear storage. And we're going to have to write this. And keeping consistent with our look and feel, we'll set up an icon. We'll make this one be the cloud icon. We'll put the words clear storage in there. We'll just add a little bit of formatting. Now we have to go inside the sidebar JS. That's going to be our controller for it. We have to add this clear storage method. So what's clear storage going to do? Well, let's write the function down here. So we want to prompt the user and ask them, do you want to clear the storage or don't you? Now we've done that before inside the delete functionality. So we'll just do that same kind of syntax here. We'll take advantage of the service called BS Dialog. and it's got this delete dialog. And then what do you want to do? Well, if they say yes, our first condition is going to be we want to confirm the delete. Otherwise, we want to cancel. So let's write the function for confirm delete. And when we do that, we're going to call data context.zstorage.clear. And we actually don't want to do anything if they cancel, so for now we'll just put a no op in there. Now we're using BS dialog, so we want to make sure that we inject that. And it's actually called our bootstrap dialog service. And then down here, we have to make sure they match up in the parameter order. And we also use the data context. So we can bring those down, make sure that they match up. And now let's go ahead and run the application and test out our functionality. And we'll open up the developer tools and check out local storage. So we do see that we indeed have local storage here. And now let's come over to the menu. We'll click on clear storage. We'll hit OK, and it should delete what happens over there. And it did disappear. So now we refresh our page. We should see local storage gets filled in again as it tries to read in the data, and then it saves it back out. In this module, we learned how we could save local storage out and then also read it back in. And to do this, we use HTML5 local storage. And if you want to make sure that your browser supports that, you want to check out the caniuse.com website. It'll tell you what features your browser supports. And to import and export our data to and from local storage, we use Breeze's import entities and export entities APIs. So why do we do this? We did this so we could reduce some of the round trips since we have the data already, and if somebody closes the browser or it accidentally gets closed, we can recover from it pretty quickly. And in the next module, you're going to see some other more advanced features that we can do using the same APIs.